June 26, 1943, began like hundreds of other escort missions over Europe. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts lifted off from English airfields before dawn, climbing slowly toward bomber altitude to meet a formation of B-17 seconds bound for targets outside Paris. The Thunderbolt was still new to combat, still mistrusted. Engineers had warned it was too heavy, too blunt, too slow to dogfight German fighters designed for elegance and climb. Many pilots believed those warnings were proving true. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson flew near the rear of the formation, a vulnerable position reserved for less experienced pilots. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin and bitterly cold, the kind that froze breath inside oxygen masks and punished exposed skin within seconds. Below them stretched occupied France. Above them, unseen, German fighters waited. Attack came without warning. 16 few 190 seconds dropped from altitude, converting height into speed with terrifying efficiency. The first cannon shell struck Johnson's P-47 almost immediately. A 20mm round detonated inside the cockpit, shredding the instrument panel, rupturing hydraulic lines, and filling the confined space with smoke, fire, and burning fluid. The canopy shattered. The controls went dead. Blood and hydraulic oil streamed across Johnson's face as his aircraft fell out of formation. In seconds, the Thunderbolt was no longer a fighter escorting bombers. It was a crippled machine tumbling toward the earth, its pilot half-blinded, half-burned, and completely alone. Behind him, closing with deliberate calm, was one of the Luftwaffe's most lethal men, a pilot who had ended more than 100 air battles exactly the same way. The Thunderbolt fell through the sky in a slow, uncontrolled spiral. Fire licked through the shattered cockpit, fed by ruptured hydraulic lines and electrical shorts. Smoke filled Johnson's lungs until each breath burned. Training told him to bail out, but the canopy had jammed half open, twisted by the explosion. He tried to force himself through the narrow gap, but his parachute snagged on torn metal. There would be no escape. As suddenly as it had started, the fire died. Whether from lack of oxygen, fuel, starvation, or simple chance, the flames vanished, leaving only smoke and silence. Johnson dropped back into his seat and fought the controls with his full body weight. The hydraulics were gone. Every movement now relied on raw cables and muscle. Slowly, grudgingly, the 7-ton aircraft responded. The spin broke. The nose leveled at 8,000 feet. And could barely see. His eyes were swollen from hydraulic burns, reduced to narrow slits. To look forward at all, he pushed his head into the open slipstream, letting 200-mile-per-hour wind scour his ruined face. Pain became the price of vision. He pointed the nose west, toward England, knowing the channel was still more than 70 miles away. It was when the German fighter appeared. Steady and precise. The F-190 eased into perfect firing position, 50 yards behind the crippled Thunderbolt. Its pilot was Egon Mayer, commander of JG-2, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished aces. He had destroyed fighters exactly like this before. Damaged, slow, defenseless. This was not a dogfight. It was an execution. Opened fire. P-47 inches long, sustained bursts. Cannon shells punched through the fuselage. Machine gun fire hammered the wings. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat rang as bullets struck it again and again, stopping inches from his spine. The entire aircraft shook as if being beaten apart from the inside. Johnson could do nothing but crouch behind the armor and endure. Seconds stretched into eternity. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. An inline engine would have seized. Wings would have folded. The pilot would already be dead or falling, but the Thunderbolt stayed airborne. Its radial engine absorbed damage and kept running. Control surfaces shredded, yet enough remained to hold the air. Air finally overshot. The German fighter flashed past Johnson's canopy. For a brief moment, the two aircraft flew side by side, Mayer looked over and saw what should not exist: a pilot still alive inside a machine that should already be wreckage. He slowed, examined the Thunderbolt from nose to tail, then looked directly at Johnson. Instead of firing, the German ace shook his head. For a few impossible seconds, there was silence in the sky. Then Mayer raised a hand in acknowledgement, a gesture of professional disbelief. He rolled away, leaving behind a truth that neither pilot would forget. This American fighter, dismissed as too heavy and too crude, was refusing to die. The reprieve lasted only moments. Johnson knew it as surely as he knew the pain in his eyes and the blood soaking his flight suit. German doctrine did not allow wounded enemy fighters to limp home. If Mayer had broken away, it was only to reset the attack. A pilot with more than 100 victories did not leave work unfinished. 190 reappeared behind him, lining up for a second pass. This time the firing was deliberate and methodical. Mayer walked his cannon fire along the length of the Thunderbolt, aiming not in anger but with practiced precision. Shells ripped into the wings, tore through control surfaces, and detonated against the engine cowling. Johnson felt each impact through the airframe, dull concussive thuds that signaled internal damage. Oil pressure dropped. Engine temperatures spiked. The propellers shuddered unevenly. The engine did not quit. It kept turning, cylinders firing independently, brute force replacing elegance. Where a liquid-cooled engine would have seized within seconds, the Thunderbolt's massive power plant absorbed the punishment and continued to pull the aircraft forward. Johnson could hear it knocking, coughing, sounding wrong in every way that mattered, but it ran. Attacked again. A sweeping deflection shot designed to rake the aircraft from nose to tail. Tracers stitched across the wings. Fuel tanks ruptured and vented harmlessly into the slipstream. Aluminum skin peeled back, exposing internal spars. Control cables snapped. The stick went soft in Johnson's hands. The P-47 was barely flying now, held aloft by momentum and stubborn design rather than control. Mayer emptied everything. Cannon, machine guns, every remaining round poured into the Thunderbolt. The sky filled with metal fragments and cordite smoke. Johnson waited for the moment when the wing would finally fail or the engine would explode. It never came. Firing stopped. The Fire 190 slid alongside once more. Mayer looked again, longer this time. What he saw defied his understanding of air combat. The Thunderbolt was shredded beyond reason, yet still airborne, still moving west. Mayer rocked his wings in salute and turned away for good. His ammunition was gone. The fight was over. Johnson watched the German fighter disappear, then focused on the only thing left that mattered: getting home. The channel was still ahead. The aircraft had no hydraulics, no flaps, no brakes, and barely any control. But it flew. Mile after mile, the wounded Thunderbolt carried its pilot toward England. What happened that day spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. Pilots reported hitting P-47 seconds until their guns ran dry, only to watch them keep flying. The aircraft engineers had called too heavy to dogfight revealed its true purpose. It was not built to dance. It was built to endure. By the time the English coastline appeared through the shredded windscreen, Johnson was no longer fighting the enemy. He was fighting physics, fatigue, and time. The Thunderbolt vibrated constantly, every damaged panel screaming in the slipstream. Oil pressure hovered at the edge of failure. The engine ran hot, uneven, wounded but still alive. Each mile felt borrowed. Control finally broke through the static. Against all probability, the radio still worked. Johnson's voice was hoarse, clipped, barely controlled as he reported his condition. The answer came quickly. He was vectored toward a forward airfield with a long runway built for emergencies, exactly like this. No flaps, no brakes, no second chances. He descended. The reality of landing set in. Without hydraulics, there would be no way to slow the aircraft once it touched down. If the Thunderbolt veered, clipped another aircraft, or struck an obstacle, The violence that had failed to kill him in the air would finish the job on the ground. Survival now depended on precision from a pilot who could barely see. And lined up on final approach at a speed far higher than normal, compensating for the lack of lift without flaps. The runway filled his vision. He eased back on the stick, feeling for a response that barely existed. The aircraft slammed onto the concrete with bone-jarring force and kept rolling, fast and unstoppable. The damaged wheels held, the tail stayed down. The Thunderbolt thundered forward, eating runway at terrifying speed. Far end, parked aircraft rushed toward him. Johnson stood on the rudder pedals, using every scrap of remaining control to keep the nose straight. Seconds stretched. The aircraft finally shuddered and slowed, coming to a stop just short of catastrophe. Silence followed, real silence this time. Johnson sat frozen, hands still gripping the stick, afraid that if he moved, the aircraft might finally remember it was supposed to be dead. When the canopy release was pulled, the mechanism collapsed entirely and the canopy fell away. Ground crews stared in disbelief. They began counting holes and gave up after 200 on one side alone. The verdict was immediate. The aircraft was beyond repair. It would be scrapped. The pilot lived. Through both air forces. For American pilots, it was proof that the Thunderbolt would bring them home. For German pilots, it was a warning. A damaged P-47 was not a kill. It was a problem that might survive everything you could throw at it. Aircraft that had been mocked as too heavy, too crude, too slow to dogfight had revealed its purpose. It was not built to win with grace. It was built to win by outlasting the violence of modern air war. In the months that followed, the meaning of that flight became impossible to ignore. Robert Johnson returned to combat only weeks later and kept flying. Mission after mission, he climbed back into another Thunderbolt and went back over enemy territory. By the end of his tour, he had scored 27 confirmed victories, breaking a record that had stood since the First World War. He survived the war not because he was reckless, but because the machine beneath him gave him time to react, time to endure, time to come home. Across the European sky, German pilots were reaching the same conclusion from the opposite side of the gun sight. Reports filtered up through Luftwaffe squadrons describing Thunderbolts that absorbed punishment and refused to fall. Ammunition expended. Fuel burned. No kill confirmed. Tactical notes began to circulate. Do not assume a damaged P-47 is finished. Avoid prolonged engagements. Never dive away. These were not compliments. They were warnings. Statistics eventually confirmed what experience was already teaching. Thunderbolts were lost at remarkably low rates compared to other fighters. Pilots flew dozens, even hundreds, of missions with survival odds no one had thought possible early in the war. The aircraft destroyed enemy fighters in the air, wrecked rail yards and armor on the ground, and still brought its pilots back alive. For every Thunderbolt lost, multiple German aircraft disappeared with no chance of survival for their crews. Engineers finally understood what they had built. The weight critics complained about was armor. The bulk was redundancy. The oversized engine was not inefficiency, but insurance. Where other fighters depended on perfection, the Thunderbolt depended on tolerance for damage, mistakes, and chaos. It was designed for a war where men and machines would be torn apart at industrial scale. Historians later debated the best fighter of the war. The arguments never ended. Some were faster, some turned tighter, some climbed higher, but none made the same promise. The P-47 did not guarantee victory in every fight. It guaranteed something more important. It gave its pilot a chance to survive the fight. June 26, 1943, that promise was tested by one of the deadliest pilots in the Luftwaffe, firing every weapon he had at point-blank range. The Thunderbolt endured it all and kept flying. It did not win through elegance or finesse. It won through brute strength and refusal. Engineers had called it too heavy to dogfight. History remembered it differently. The story of Robert S. Johnson and the P-47 Thunderbolt offers a lesson that goes far beyond one extraordinary combat encounter. It reveals a fundamental truth about modern warfare, engineering philosophy, and human survival under industrialized violence. At first glance, the narrative appears to celebrate brute strength, a massive fighter absorbing punishment that should have destroyed it. But the deeper lesson is not about invincibility. It is about design choices made long before combat began, about assumptions challenged under fire, and about how wars are actually won and survived, not in theory, but in reality. Before the Thunderbolt ever flew into combat, it was already controversial. Engineers and tacticians looked at its weight, its size, and its lack of elegance and concluded that it violated the principles of fighter design. Air combat theory, shaped by interwar dogfighting ideals, emphasized maneuverability, climb rate, and turning performance. A fighter was expected to win by outmaneuvering its opponent, not by absorbing damage. By those standards, the P-47 looked wrong. It was heavy, bulky, and powered by an enormous radial engine that seemed better suited to bombers than fighters. Critics saw inefficiency where Republic aviation engineers saw margin. Contrast between theory and reality lies at the heart of the lesson. Theories of war are built in classrooms, offices, and test ranges. Real wars are fought in smoke, fear, chaos, and error. In that environment, perfection is fragile. Systems that rely on flawless execution collapse quickly when conditions deviate from the ideal. The Thunderbolt was not designed to be perfect. It was designed to survive imperfection. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized in 1943. Johnson's ordeal demonstrates this brutally. No amount of piloting skill could have saved him after the first cannon shell exploded inside his cockpit. He did not outfly his enemy. He did not outthink him. He endured. His survival depended not on split-second decisions, but on the accumulated consequences of engineering redundancy. Armor plate thick enough to stop bullets, fuel tanks that sealed themselves when punctured, a radial engine capable of losing cylinders and still producing power. These were not glamorous features. They did not win air shows or impress theorists. But when everything went wrong, they bought time. Time is the true currency of survival in combat. Every additional second an aircraft stays airborne gives its pilot another chance to react, to escape, to recover control, or simply to remain alive. In Johnson's case, those seconds added up to minutes, and those minutes added up to miles. A lighter, more elegant fighter might have avoided damage in the first place, but once hit, it would have failed catastrophically. The Thunderbolt accepted being hit and continued functioning anyway. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate design philosophy. Philosophy reflects a broader American approach to industrial warfare. The United States did not attempt to win by building the most refined or delicate machines. It built machines that could be produced in large numbers, maintained by average crews, and survive abuse. The Thunderbolt embodied this mindset. Its engine was not optimized for minimal weight, but for reliability and power. Its structure was not optimized for minimal material use, but for strength. Its cockpit was not cramped and minimal, but spacious and protected. Every one of these choices increased weight. Every one of them increased survival. And here is uncomfortable for those who prefer clean solutions and elegant answers. Robustness often looks inefficient on paper. Redundancy looks like waste. Armor looks like unnecessary mass. But in environments where failure is inevitable, robustness outperforms optimization. The P-47 did not assume that pilots would never be hit. It assumed that they would be hit repeatedly and built accordingly. That assumption proved correct. Luftwaffe learned this lesson from the opposite side of the gun sight. German fighter design prioritized performance. Aircraft like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were superb machines, optimized for speed, climb, and firepower. They were lethal in the hands of skilled pilots, but they were also unforgiving. Damage to critical systems often meant immediate loss. A single shell through a coolant line could end an aircraft within minutes. This was acceptable early in the war, when Germany enjoyed tactical advantages and experienced pilots. As the war progressed and losses mounted, the cost of fragility became apparent. And survival became part of Luftwaffe folklore not because it was unique, but because it was repeated. German pilots encountered thunderbolts that refused to die. They fired until ammunition ran out and watched their targets limp away. This had psychological consequences. Confidence in weapons eroded. Tactical assumptions failed. A damaged enemy aircraft was no longer a guaranteed kill. The P-47 forced German pilots to expend more effort, more ammunition, and more time for fewer results. In a war of attrition, that mattered. Attrition is another key lesson. The Thunderbolt was not just a tactical success. It was a strategic one. It flew hundreds of thousands of sorties. It destroyed aircraft, trains, vehicles, and infrastructure. But perhaps its most important contribution was statistical. P-47 pilots survived at rates unmatched by most other fighters. Experienced pilots lived to fight again. Skills accumulated instead of being lost. Units retained institutional knowledge. The war became progressively harder for Germany as Allied pilot experience increased and German experience declined. Highlights a truth often overlooked in discussions of weapons performance. Survivability multiplies effectiveness over time. A weapon that brings its operator home preserves experience. Experience improves outcomes. Improved outcomes reduce losses. Reduced losses further preserve experience. This feedback loop is powerful. The Thunderbolt did not merely destroy enemy assets, it preserved Allied human capital. The story also challenges the romantic idea of the lone ace winning through superior skill alone. Johnson was a skilled pilot, but skill did not save him that day. Engineering did. This does not diminish human courage or training. It contextualizes them. Courage and skill matter most when supported by systems that allow mistakes, absorb shocks, and recover from damage. Without such systems, even the bravest individuals are consumed by the machinery of war. Also a moral dimension to this lesson. The Thunderbolt was built around a promise: bring the pilot home. That promise shaped decisions at every level of design. Armor plate, behind the seat, exists for one reason. Self-sealing fuel tanks exist for one reason. Redundant systems exist for one reason. They acknowledge that human life has value beyond immediate tactical gain. This does not make war humane, but it does make it survivable for those forced to fight it. Contrast this with systems designed primarily for maximum lethality or performance, where operator survival is secondary. Such systems may excel briefly but exact a higher long-term cost. The Thunderbolt's legacy suggests that protecting the operator is not a weakness, but a strategic strength. An air force that values pilot survival can sustain operations longer, adapt faster, and recover more effectively from losses. The lesson extends beyond aviation. In any complex system operating under stress, designs that tolerate failure outperform those that demand perfection. This applies to engineering, organizations, and even societies. Systems built with margin, redundancy, and resilience survive crises that destroy optimized but brittle alternatives. The P-47 is a physical embodiment of that principle. It also teaches humility. Engineers did not fully understand what they had built until combat revealed it. Pilots did not trust the aircraft until it saved them. Enemies did not respect it until it refused to die. Real-world testing under extreme conditions overturned expert opinion. This is a reminder that theoretical expertise must always be tempered by empirical reality. The story teaches that victory in industrial war is rarely about elegance. It is about endurance. The Thunderbolt did not win hearts with beauty or grace. It won by staying in the air when logic said it should fall. It won by absorbing violence and continuing its mission. It won by turning weight into survival, and survival into strategic advantage. Engineers called the P-47 too heavy to dogfight. They were not entirely wrong within their framework, but the framework itself was incomplete. War did not reward the lightest or the most agile alone. It rewarded those who could survive being hit, return tomorrow, and keep fighting. On June 26, 1943, that reality was written into the sky over France, not in equations or doctrines, but in bullet holes, burning metal, and one aircraft that refused to die. The enduring lesson is simple and uncomfortable. In the real world, strength often looks like excess until the moment it becomes necessary. The Thunderbolt existed for that moment, and when it came, it delivered on its promise. The story of Robert S. Johnson and the P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely an account of an extraordinary survival. It is a case study in how modern war actually works when theory collides with reality. On paper, the Thunderbolt violated nearly every rule of pre-war fighter doctrine. It was overweight, oversized, slow to climb, and clumsy in a turning fight. Engineers, analysts, and even pilots questioned whether it belonged in air combat at all. Yet the lesson that emerged from Johnson's ordeal and from thousands of similar missions flown by P-47 pilots is that war does not reward elegance, it rewards resilience. The aircraft that survives long enough to keep fighting ultimately matters more than the aircraft that performs best under ideal conditions. For the war, air combat theory was dominated by the idea of maneuver warfare in the sky. Fighters were expected to win through speed, agility, and precision. Damage was assumed to be rare, and when it occurred, the aircraft was expected to be lost. This thinking shaped designs across Europe. Fighters became lighter, tighter, and more optimized. Every kilogram saved translated into better climb or turn performance. The result was machines that excelled in clean dogfights but had very little tolerance for error or damage. When hit, they failed catastrophically. That risk was accepted because designers believed skilled pilots would avoid being hit in the first place. P-47 was built on a different assumption. Republic Aviation's engineers assumed that pilots would be hit. They assumed that anti-aircraft fire, cannon shells, machine gun rounds, mechanical failures, weather, fatigue, and human error would all play a role. Instead of trying to eliminate risk entirely, they designed an aircraft that could absorb it. Armor plate behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, thick wing spars, redundant control systems, and a massive radial engine were not accidents or inefficiencies. They were deliberate choices, rooted in a brutal understanding of combat conditions. The Thunderbolt was not designed to be untouched. It was designed to survive being touched. Johnson's experience demonstrates why that assumption mattered. Once his cockpit was hit and his systems were destroyed, skill alone was no longer decisive. There was no maneuver left to perform, no clever tactic to execute. His survival depended entirely on whether the machine around him could continue functioning despite catastrophic damage. The P-47 did. A lighter aircraft would have failed instantly. An inline engine would have seized. Fuel tanks would have ignited. Control surfaces would have torn away. Johnson lived because the Thunderbolt had margin built from weight, redundancy, and brute strength. Leads to a crucial lesson. Margin is often misunderstood as waste until it becomes essential. In peacetime engineering, efficiency is prized, redundancy is cut, excess capacity is trimmed. Systems are optimized to perform exactly as required, no more and no less. In war, this logic collapses. Conditions are unpredictable, damage is inevitable. Systems that operate close to their limits fail quickly when stressed. Systems with margin survive long enough to adapt. The Thunderbolt's excess was not waste, it was insurance. Luftwaffe learned this lesson the hard way. German fighters were deadly in skilled hands, but they were fragile. As pilot quality declined and Allied numbers increased, fragility became fatal. German pilots began encountering Thunderbolts that refused to fall. Ammunition was expended without results. Confidence eroded. Tactical certainty disappeared. A damaged P-47 was no longer assumed destroyed. That uncertainty mattered psychologically and operationally. War is not only fought with weapons, but with expectations. When expectations fail, decision-making degrades. Statistical consequences of survivability are even more important than the dramatic anecdotes. Aircraft that bring their pilots home preserve experience. Experienced pilots are more lethal, more adaptable, and more disciplined. They make fewer mistakes and survive longer. This creates a feedback loop. High survivability leads to experience retention. Experience retention leads to higher effectiveness. Higher effectiveness reduces losses further. The P-47 enabled this cycle. Its pilots lived to fly again. Over time, this mattered more than raw performance metrics. Highlights a deeper strategic lesson. Human capital is the most valuable resource in war. Machines can be replaced. Trained, experienced personnel cannot, not quickly. An aircraft that sacrifices pilot survivability for marginal performance gains is strategically inferior in prolonged conflict. The Thunderbolt's design implicitly recognized this. It prioritized the pilot's life over aerodynamic purity. That decision paid dividends across hundreds of thousands of sorties. The story also reframes the role of heroism in modern warfare. Johnson was brave, but bravery did not save him. Engineering did. This does not diminish individual courage, it contextualizes it. Modern war is not won by isolated acts of heroism alone. It is won by systems that allow humans to survive long enough for courage, skill, and experience to matter repeatedly. A system that consumes its operators quickly, no matter how impressive its peak performance, loses in the long run. Also a moral dimension to this lesson. Designing for survivability is an ethical choice as much as a tactical one. It acknowledges that those sent to fight are not expendable components, but human beings whose lives have value beyond immediate outcomes. The Thunderbolt embodied that philosophy. It was built to bring its pilot home, even when everything else went wrong. That promise shaped its reputation and its legacy. The contrast between American and German industrial philosophy reinforces this point. American industry emphasized scale, redundancy, and reliability. German industry emphasized precision and performance. Both approaches produced impressive machines, but only one scaled effectively under attrition. The Thunderbolt was not merely a fighter, it was a product of an industrial system designed to sustain prolonged conflict. Its success cannot be separated from the factories, logistics, and design culture that produced it. The other lesson lies in humility. Experts were wrong. The aircraft dismissed as inferior became indispensable. Real-world combat exposed the limits of theoretical models. This is a warning against overconfidence in abstract analysis, divorced from operational reality. War is the ultimate stress test, and it frequently invalidates assumptions made in controlled environments. Thunderbolt also teaches that strength does not need to be subtle. In a world obsessed with optimization, its bluntness was an advantage. It did not need to be the best at everything. It needed to be good enough at enough things to survive. That philosophy applies far beyond aviation. In any high-risk environment, robustness often beats specialization. The enduring lesson of Johnson's flight is that survival itself can be a form of victory. The P-47 did not defeat Egon Mayer in a dogfight that day. It did something more consequential. It denied the enemy a kill. It preserved a pilot who would fly again. It demonstrated to both sides that American aircraft were built to endure punishment and keep fighting. That message echoed across the skies of Europe and shaped behavior on both sides. Engineers once called the P-47 too heavy to dogfight. History judged it differently. It was heavy because it carried protection. It was bulky because it carried margin. It was strong because it was meant to endure. In the end, the Thunderbolt's greatest lesson is simple but profound. In wars of attrition, The machine that refuses to die often matters more than the machine that wins the cleanest fight. The story of the 6-rifle tactic at Stalingrad is, above all, a lesson about how human beings behave when systems collapse and certainty disappears. It is easy to remember Stalingrad as a clash of armies, factories, and casualty figures, but the reality was far more intimate and unsettling. The battle revealed that war, stripped of movement and clarity, becomes a contest of perception, patience, and psychological endurance. What Vasily Zaitsev created did not succeed because it was clever in a technical sense. It succeeded because it aligned perfectly with how humans think, fear, and repeat behavior under extreme stress. The first and most fundamental lesson is that environment always wins. No doctrine survives unchanged when the environment shifts radically. The German army entered Stalingrad with confidence built on years of victory. Their doctrine assumed space, maneuver, and momentum. Stalingrad offered none of these. The city erased distance, blurred front lines, and turned every piece of rubble into potential cover. In such an environment, strength became irrelevant if it could not be applied. The Red Army, forced to fight with its back against the Volga, adapted not because it wanted to innovate, but because it had no choice. This pattern repeats throughout history. Adaptation rarely comes from brilliance. It comes from necessity. Those who adapt survive. Those who cling to past success suffer. The second lesson is that reality punishes assumptions faster than mistakes. German counter-sniper efforts failed, not because the Germans lacked skill, but because they trusted assumptions that no longer held. They assumed snipers would behave according to training manuals. They assumed high ground was always superior. They assumed threats would reveal themselves logically. Zaitsev rejected all of this. He treated the battlefield as a living system shaped by human behavior rather than geometry. He watched how soldiers moved when they thought they were safe. He noticed pauses, routines, and habits. The 6-rifle tactic exploited these behaviors, not enemy firepower. It teaches a broader truth. In any complex system, the greatest vulnerability is not ignorance, but false certainty. When people believe they understand a situation completely, they stop observing. Zaitsev's advantage was not superior equipment. It was humility before reality. He did not assume. He watched. The third lesson is that isolation is death under pressure. The lone sniper is a romantic image, but in reality, isolation creates fragility. German counter-sniper doctrine depended on finding isolated threats and eliminating them. Zaitsev's system removed isolation entirely. Every sniper pair was protected by another. Every movement was covered. Blind spots were intentional, not accidental. This transformed survivability. The system absorbed risk rather than concentrating it. The lesson applies universally. Systems that rely on individual brilliance fail when pressure increases. Systems that distribute awareness, responsibility, and protection endure. Coordination does not reduce effectiveness. It multiplies it. The fourth lesson is that fear reshapes behavior faster than bullets reshape battlefields. The 6-rifle tactic did not inflict massive casualties compared to artillery or infantry assaults, yet its psychological impact was devastating. German officers stopped moving. Orders slowed. Units froze. Fear did not destroy the German army physically. It destroyed its initiative. And without initiative, numbers become meaningless. It works this way because it attacks confidence. Humans can endure danger if they understand it. They struggle when danger is unpredictable. Zaitsev's teams weaponized uncertainty. Silence became threatening. Stillness became deadly. Soldiers feared standing up more than being attacked. This paralysis was more damaging than any single kill. The fifth lesson is that patience is power in environments of complexity. Stalingrad punished speed and rewarded stillness. Impulsive movement exposed silhouettes. Aggressive probing revealed patterns. Zaitsev's teams waited. They let the enemy reveal himself. This restraint required discipline, not passivity. Waiting was an active decision, rooted in understanding how humans behave when nothing happens for long enough. Relaxation creates exposure. Routine creates vulnerability. Lesson contradicts modern instincts that equate action with control. Sometimes control comes from refusing to act until the environment forces the enemy to make a mistake. The sixth lesson is that doctrine becomes dangerous when it replaces thinking. German counter-snipers were well-trained professionals. Their failure came from obedience to methods that no longer fit reality. They applied solutions that had worked elsewhere. Zaitsev ignored doctrine entirely. His thinking came from hunting, not from textbooks. He understood that humans behave like animals under stress, repeating patterns and exposing themselves when they believe they are unseen. Organizations fail when doctrine becomes identity. Success hardens into certainty. Certainty resists change. Stalingrad punished certainty mercilessly. The seventh lesson is that knowledge multiplies faster than force. Zaitsev's personal kill count mattered, but it was not decisive. What mattered was teaching. By training others, he turned insight into a system. Even after he was wounded, the method continued. This is true leadership. Leaders who must be present for success create fragile systems. Leaders who build transferable methods create resilience. The eighth lesson is that myths obscure truth. After the war, propaganda turned Zaitsev into a symbol. Duels were exaggerated. Stories were simplified. These myths satisfied emotional needs but buried the real lesson. The danger of myth is that it attributes success to extraordinary individuals instead of repeatable systems. This prevents learning. It allows people to admire rather than understand. The real lesson is uncomfortable. Ordinary people using insight systematically can change outcomes dramatically. There is no magic in this, only observation, discipline, and patience. The ninth lesson is that technology never replaces psychology. Stalingrad demonstrated that advanced weapons mean little if they do not align with human behavior. Rifles, scopes, and artillery mattered less than fear, fatigue, and habit. Zaitsev's system succeeded because it targeted how people think under pressure. This truth remains relevant today. Technology evolves faster than human nature. Those who understand human behavior retain an advantage no matter how tools change. The 10th lesson is humility. Zaitsev did not seek fame. He adapted to survive. His effectiveness came from recognizing his own limits and observing others honestly. The German failure was not one of courage or intelligence. It was a failure to accept that the environment had changed beyond their assumptions. Humility allows reassessment. Arrogance locks systems into collapse. Together, these lessons explain why Stalingrad was not simply a battle of attrition, it was a battle of understanding. The Germans searched for a sniper because they framed the problem incorrectly. They looked for a man when they were facing a method. They sought elimination instead of comprehension. By the time they realized the difference, control had already slipped away. The enduring lesson of the six-rifle tactic is not about killing. It is about thinking clearly under pressure. Observation over assumption, coordination over isolation, patience over impulse, systems over individuals. These principles apply far beyond war. They apply wherever humans face uncertainty, complexity, and fear. Stalingrad did not fall because one side was stronger. It fell because one side learned faster. The story of the six-rifle tactic at Stalingrad offers a lesson far deeper than sniping or battlefield ingenuity. It reveals how human systems behave when order collapses, how fear reshapes decision-making, and how understanding reality matters more than strength, numbers, or even courage. At its heart, this is a story about thinking correctly under pressure, and how the side that adapts fastest, not the side that strikes hardest, ultimately prevails. Stalingrad was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was an environment where all familiar reference points dissolved. Streets disappeared under rubble. Buildings became vertical labyrinths. Front lines existed only for minutes at a time before collapsing into confusion. In such conditions, pre-war doctrine became a liability. German operational thinking had been built around clarity, open terrain, coordinated movement, clear lines of advance. Stalingrad destroyed clarity itself. What replaced it was ambiguity, concealment, and proximity. Victory no longer depended on maneuver, but on perception. The first lesson is that environments dictate outcomes more than plans ever do. No matter how refined a doctrine is, it only works when the environment supports its assumptions. The German army did not lose at Stalingrad because its doctrine was poorly designed. It lost because it refused to recognize that the environment had invalidated that doctrine. The Red Army, fighting with fewer resources and under greater desperation, adapted because it had no alternative. Adaptation is rarely driven by brilliance. It is driven by necessity. History consistently shows that the side forced to confront reality without illusions often gains the advantage over the side still clinging to past success. The second lesson is that human behavior is more predictable than any weapon system. German counter-sniper efforts focused on technology, optics, firing angles, elevation, and cover. These tools were effective in many contexts,